Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Okay. The last session, we finished talking about Unit 12, right? Applications of Anthropology. We're going to begin with the Unit 9.5. Okay. I left the Unit 9.5 towards the end because some terminology that we are going to use here will be useful to us in understanding our ancestors. Okay, the fossils. So in 1.6 that we are going to talk about, some terminology is useful to that. That is why I kept 9.5 in the end. So what does 9.5 deals with? What is the scope of Unit 9.5? Let's have a look at that. So as you see here, 9.5 deals with race and racism concept. Okay, so here the topics have a lot of overlapping ideas here. They become eventually clear to you. They're asking us to learn about biological basis of morphological variation. Biological basis of morphological variation, the appearance, variation in appearance, variance in looks. Okay, and what is the biological basis that define this morphological variation that we see among humans of non-metric and metric characteristics? So we're going to split the information. We're going to talk about various characteristics and see what is the biological reasoning behind those appearances and which of them are non-metric or quantifiable characteristics, non-quantifiable characteristics, metric and non-metric characteristics. Plus, they also briefly ask us to learn about criteria that is being used for classifying races or racial criteria, it is called, racial traits in relation to heredity and environment. So can you classify or can you understand the basis of heredity or genetics, genetic components for these racial traits, the traits that we are going to talk about as first part, morphological variations or variables that we are going to discuss. Here we have to briefly learn, but this is a core theme. What is the biological basis for morphological variations, which fall under the racial criteria? Okay, I'm going to give you a few definitions on them and how are we going to divide that. And then we are going to discuss briefly about what are the genetic components and what are the environmental components. How sensitive are these characteristics to each of those contexts? Okay, is it genetically controlled or is it environmentally controlled? What is known about it basically? We may not come to a clear conclusion, but based on the current literature, we may be able to say what is known about it. Then biological basis of racial classification. So which is nothing but biological basis for the morphological variation. Because based on the morphological variation, we as humans started classifying the other individuals or other groups into various races. So both of these, biological basis of racial classification, biological basis of morphological variation of various characteristics that are used in classifying races are the same. Okay, so depending on how, in what context the question is asked, your tone should be different. Otherwise, the information is same for both of them. Then we have two short notes like racial differentiation. In a way, again, we are referring to the same thing. It is very redundant. you see in the syllabus, they're asking about how do you differentiate races? What is the criteria for racial differentiation? We differentiate them based on some distinct characteristics, right? So racial differentiation also refers to that. Okay, plus race crossing in man. Have you seen anything that happened between two different races? Was there any exchange of genetic information between two different categories of human groups or races? So race crossing in man. Okay, any examples of race crossing in man that we're going to talk about? Right, this is a brief idea. Overall concept is understanding what is race and racism. Are they both mean the same? Okay, understand these questions. Do race and racism, do they mean same? And second, is it biologically, are we seeing the concept of race in biological sense or in cultural sense or in social sense? Do they have different meanings? Because usually this is the type of questions that we are seeing in the exam. Race concept, okay, biological concept of race or meaning of race in social context. Okay, so the way we consider it seems to be different. First of all, we'll learn the basics and then we'll try to decide. I'm going to give you a video which describes whether it is biologically valid or socially valid, how different anthropologists, for example, or biologists think about it. Okay, so this is what we are going to discuss today. So we're going to focus on various different dimensions of the concept of race and racism. Okay, what is your understanding of a race? How do you define a race, or what is your understanding in general sense, any of you? So what is race meaning to you?
And in cultural anthropology, we learned about Risley's classification.
Did you learn about this classification of Indian races?
Yeah, so he did it on the basis of anthropometric.
Correct. Right.
So, facial classification on the for distinguishing between the two regions, people of two regions, like
So some form of anthropometry you are saying. So it's like Risley's classification, for example, utilize some anthropometric measures in order to classify people, correct? Indian races, for example. Okay. Right. So what are you trying to say here? The race means what?
facial features,
Okay. Facial features.
like in cultural anthropology, we have studied the Aryans used to have a long nose as compared to the Dravidians.
Right. So I'm looking at a broader picture because we are just beginning the discussion here. I'm looking at a broader picture than specifics. So you're giving me some specific reasons. Okay. With those reasons, what are you trying to establish, or what someone had already attempted to establish?
I think it's a classification or a group of people based on similar, say, physical features and maybe some more genetic features as well.
So it's like classifying humans into different subgroups based on some distinctive features. For that, you may use, facial features. You may use different indices, for example. But idea is to classify humans. We classify them into different subcategories based on some similarities or based on some distinct features they may have. Correct? Okay. Right. So then what approach are we using? Are we using a biological approach here or social approach or cultural approach here?
I think it's primarily biological. Uh, and then maybe within a particular subgroup, maybe we add a bit of social and cultural.
The way different people from different study areas, like biologists, the way they look at the concept of race may be different from the way sociologists or the way cultural anthropologists looks at it. Okay, and definitely there seem to be some biological variation that we all have The question is, it's sufficient enough to classify people based on that? Okay, question mark. Second, does it have the same meaning in the social context? Is the concept of racism the same as a race? Okay, so we have to answer these questions in the process. I'm going to give you a bit of idea on this and bit of reading on this, because a lot of work has been done. Different people have talked about this concept. Okay, towards the end, once we finish talking about some of the basics, okay, maybe either today's class or tomorrow's class, I'm going to talk to you about what anthropologists have decided to do in the end, when they have seen that the concept of race has been taking a different meaning altogether. Okay, so first let's figure out the basics related to that. So we're talking about, I think I'd like to begin with this cartoon. So this cartoon is taken from American Anthropological Association newsletter, where you notice what these two people are doing. Homo sapiens celebrating their diversity. So we're all acknowledging the diversity that we have. We're trying to celebrate it. How? By fighting like this. Okay. So because the concept of race had probably took wrong turn, it looks like. So it's very important to understand why we have variations. I think in the biological context, what we are seeing in the physical anthropology is what biology can explain with respect to the differences that we have. Okay, I'm going to send a video later. Okay, you will see this is a bit longer video. So I would like you to see it later. Okay, for now, I think we'll continue with some understanding of race. So what does it mean by a race? Anthropologists have classified humans into various races, sometimes based on geographical locations, meaning where do they live, what is their skin color, so how do they look in terms of their skin color, body type, body size, okay, tall, short, shape of the head. Sometimes we can also make the difference with respect to the shape of the head. That of course anthropometrically has to be calculated. We are going to learn about that. And even type of hair, texture of hair, like that there are many ways that anthropologists attempted to classify humans, either based on where they live, the geographical location, the skin color, body size and type, head shape, nose shape, face shape, hair texture, lots of those things. I'm going to give you under racial criteria what are all those things that we have used and how different races differ. Okay, so definitely I think you see that humans are known to be a good classifiers. Humans are known to be very good classifiers. As soon as you look at someone, what do? You would immediately figure out how different is that person from you. I mean, not, we don't look, we actually, of course, we do recognize the similarities there as well, but mostly we are able to pick up the differences that you may have. How different is their clothing, how different is their, behavior, eating behavior, talking behavior, walking behavior, all sorts of things. Because inherently in our brain, I think we are programmed to classify things. Good, bad, rich, poor, tall, dwarf, all sorts of things. We can clearly see the antonyms in a way when we see things like that. Correct? Okay. So, of course, anthropologists being given that this is one of their research areas, they attempted to further went on even measuring them, quantifying those characteristics and showing the presence of individuals who did not fit the type. When the anthropologists classified them, some people might have not fit into that category. They started challenging them. There was a type of debate that had begun. People who didn't fit into the criteria, they started questioning the validity of the race concept, because this classification did not satisfy all the requirements of different groups. And we may not be able to find pure racial types, examples of pure racial type. This is how Caucasoid looks like. This is how Mongoloid should look like. The pure elements probably are missing because of various factors. Okay, so definitely concept of race has some biological meaning or origin to it, where we can use various features of our body to classify people, but we may not be able to fit everyone into those classes. So they started challenging it, and we may not be able to find pure racial type, those people who have purely those characteristics. I think over a period of time, this is getting more and more difficult because of intermixing or race crossing. Okay. So I would actually briefly start the discussion. I would put some questions in your head. Okay, I'm going to give you two sources for you to read on this. There's one from Biological Anthropology book, because I've seen that different people give slightly different information related to that, and I don't think you can say this is right or this is wrong. There are enough historical aspects that you can pinpoint. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief of idea on this from Stanford, where they talk about race and racism in the 20th century. They talk about what is called race and racism in 20th century. Some of these we already discussed. How race concept is seen, and racism is basically looking into social context. We'll talk about that after this. And changing attitudes towards race and race in anthropology. Okay, brief idea, because this type of theories are required for you to answer some of the questions. First, let's begin us asking this question. Is race a biological concept? Depending on who you ask this question, answer may be different. Sometimes if you ask sociologists, they may say yes, race is a biological concept. If you ask a biologist, they may say it is more in social, taking the social context. So there are definitely a lot of differences in the way we take the concept of race. But we all recognize, I think so far in many chapters we talked about this, the genetic basis for variation we discussed. Why some people are tall, why some tall people tends to be found in sometimes in warm climates, and if you move towards the polar regions, why people are more stocky. These type of concepts we looked at, correct? But we all recognize that there is enough variation in us. Human variation is essential. We all have enough variation, and that variation seems to be essential for our survival. So some of the features, physical features that we are going to talk next, there is definitely biological basis to that. And that variation is essential. It's part of evolution. We discuss this in theories of evolution. Variation is source of that change. Mutation, recombination, all sorts of things would introduce those type of variations. And they make us fit because we select the ones that fit best. Or those people who have those best qualities would survive, others would not survive. So variation is the core idea behind evolution, and it is common in all species, not just in humans. Viruses, now we are hearing quite a bit about coronaviral new strains. Variation is a natural phenomena, natural process. And some differences in them attributed to races are the result of biological adaptive response to climate. Some of these distinct features that we notice in them seems to be the result of us adapting to the new climates. Right, skin color, for example, I'm going to discuss as one of the right points and criteria that we do definitely differ in skin. There is no deniable. This is undeniable fact. There's no doubt about that. But why? The question is why? Is it to differentiate people based on our qualities, our abilities, or is it the process of getting adapted to the climate that we are living in? So there is definitely a biological reason behind the differences that we have in our features, the differences we show in our features. There's no doubt about that. But humans have never been isolated long enough. We of course survived. If you see the African theory, out of Africa theories, of these theories that we're going to discuss in 1.5, 1.6, we notice that people might have started, evolved from Africa and might have migrated from Africa as per one of the theories. But later, a lot of intermixing had taken place. We probably were not isolated enough to become a completely different race. If you consider race as a subspecies, group of subspecies, or subgroup of a species, right? Homo sapiens we call. Homo means humans, human related. If there are enough subgroups, right? If the subgroups are kept away from each other, the races would have eventually become another new species. But did it happen? Did human races have evolved into new species? Have you heard anything like that? Have you seen any evidences that we have a different species of human? No, we put all humans into one species, Homo. But we had ancestors who had some, features that were more like apes, less like humans, and eventually they become more like the modern humans. So we do have some overlap there. But I don't think we had enough time to let them become a new species. So that didn't happen. We have distinct features, but we didn't allow them to become a new species. So biologically, race has a meaning, but it is only telling us this is part of our survival, and it should not be the means of differentiating people. The question is, how did you consider this? Is where the problem has started. So if we continue with the concept of this biological concept of race and move towards the social concept of race, so what would you learn here? Many scholars believe that we belong to one human race which originated in Africa. So many people say we have a lot of similarities. Of course, we do have differences. That is in the process of adapting to the environment. But we might have started all our life together in Africa and then moved to different regions, then giving rise to people with differences that we are noticing today. What type of aspects led to this? People from Africa migrated. They geographically separated from each other. Population genetics we talked about. In evolution we talked about. Speciation. Geographical separation is needed. So gene pool should not be mixed. If one group separates into two groups, and if there's intermixing within those groups, and the mutations and other changes would accumulate, and they may become different from the original group. Okay, geographical separation. So we got moved away from each other, separated from each other, and inbreeding, and then they married. There was exchange of genetic information within them. So this led to more accumulated changes in us, which are maybe referred to races. So migration, geographical separation, and inbreeding followed by this led to the formation of more or less distinct races. So this is probably what had happened. They might have started life in Africa, then migrated. There was separation, geographical separation, genetic exchange within them. Of course, some distinct features have developed as part of natural selection. But did it continue forever? No, it didn't. Humanity has experienced so much of intermixing that race as a biological category might have lost its meaning. So biological differences do exist, but more and more intermixing is happening because of more connectivity, advancement in technology, trade, for various different reasons that we kind of already discussed. Okay, now so much of intermixing has happened. So many characteristics have been exchanged. So now I don't know whether biological meaning of race is any more true or any more valid. So race concept is where if you're actually able to differentiate them enough, and if they withstand or sustain those changes for a long period of time, then they may acquire distinct changes. But that is not happening because of lot of new factors. So intermixing is happening. We are losing that distinction. That differences are becoming small and small. But although, so these dynamics are happening because biology is such a concept. But what about sociologists? Sociologists still use the word race, concept of race. And when they say word race, if you go to America, they say white race, black race. Sometimes you might have heard in olden days, good race, bad race, they used to call. Or sometimes you hear people saying Australian race, European race. Sometimes even within Asia, they might use the words this race and that race because they're just trying to distinguish the perceptions that we have with respect to race. They use race, the term race, because perceptions of race affect the lives of most people only. The way they consider, the way they distinguish people seems to have, sociological meaning to it. We're not seeing people because they're biologically different. We are recognizing them with biological differences. But in the social context, we are trying to separate them. We are trying to treat them differently. The way whites treated blacks in Americas. When slavery had happened, they thought blacks are meant for this. They are inferior to them. They are less intelligent than them. They took a different meaning of race. They said biological differences, they connected to the concept of race, but which has social impact, where people were treated differently. Correct? So definitely there is two different meanings to race. One, the way biologists look at it. Two, the way people from cultural anthropology or social anthropology look at it. How do you classify it? How do you see it differently? May change, may differ. So, are you following this concept the two different ways that we are looking at the concept of race? Biological context, social context. There is an overlap because the way you look at them or the way you recognize them is based on their morphological features. Or sometimes sociologists or many other anthropologists prefer to use the term ethnic groups rather than using the word races. Because ethnically we are different, meaning culturally we are different. We may have different cultures. We may actually have different cultural practices. The way we eat, the way people eat in China, for example, or Japan, for example, chopsticks when they use compared to people the way they eat with spoons, forceps, or when they come to India, most of the areas we eat with hands. So culturally, you can see the distinction here. Culturally, you see the differences that we all have. So when you're looking into these differences, which are mostly cultural in nature, you tend to call them as an ethnic group. Sometimes they may go even much further than this. We probably studied this concept of ethnocentrism, right? You studied ethnocentrism concept, ethnocentric nature, like where culturally people think what they are following is right, what they are following is correct. So we are more. There were in history we also notice that ethnocentric concept being programmed in our heads. So definitely there are at least two versions to this concept of race. One may be a biological version of it, another one may be a social version. Okay, there are many examples. I think in the material that I'm going to share with you, some of these we already discussed. They talked about concept of racism as prejudicial belief that members of one ethnic group are superior to the others. So what happens in the racism? In racism, maybe one group believes that, or they probably have a prejudice that their members are better. Their members are better. They're more superior over the others. They're more intelligent than the others. The way whites thought about blacks. Okay, so that is the concept of racism, where they're classifying people and attaching the abilities, the superiorities to the appearance. That is where I think the problem I had. Stereotyping. You notice that a lot of stereotyping had taken place. So where started seeing social differences among people, among various groups. And there is no wonder, even if you hear that this concept of racism even exists today, although we don't accept it. If you go to Americas, if you go to other places, Europe, the way they look at you still didn't change. Although they're more polite, they're more careful in the way they say it, but they actually can see you belong to a different organization, different region. Okay, your qualities may be inferior to them or superior to them, so that they can definitely see it, but they may not say it. Okay, Nazis time they talked about in Depression era in Germany, the Nazis time, the ideology centered along celebration of Aryanism. So they always thought Aryans were more superior. The features of Aryanism they wanted to keep. That we discussed that in eugenics concept. You can also cite that example here. I'm going to share this article with you where you can briefly understand the connection between that. So definitely it was racial differentiation that they have done. Okay, so superior race versus inferior race, an ideology that you have seen there. And even Japan, they talked about second example in Japan after Nazism. In Germany, they talked about Japan where they provide a godlike status to emperor. The emperors or their families are seen as if they are gods. It still continues to some extent. Queen of England, for example. So some places, even if you go to many European countries, they still have the concept of kings, right? They receive some special, attention. Okay, of course, it reduced quite a bit, but this is a continuation of what used to happen in the past. Okay, so like that, they briefly talked about this, and even in Asian countries, they briefly talked about the concept that happens in Asian countries like Chinese provinces, for example, in Asian nations. how they considered some of the colonizers. Okay, how they see them as inferiors than the locals, like that. And black and white, or blacks and whites discrimination that had happened in olden days in Americas. So those are some examples that we can cite to understand or explain the concept of racism. But now the concept of race and racism had changed a bit. How and why, I'm going to put it this in the end. For now, I'm going to briefly go through the criteria for this. How do you classify them? Okay, how do you classify these components and what is the biological meaning to that? And this concept of race theory had started much earlier. This concept probably was there since beginning. Okay, some notable ones I'm like to mention here, starting with Carolus Linnaeus. You can date this concept much earlier than that. Okay, but I think more stronger classification probably had happened since we started recognizing the differences in species. So like Carolus Linnaeus, we talked about him, Swedish biologist. In his book Systema Naturae, when he classified living things, in his book Systema Naturae, he classified humans into 4 races. Okay, Americans, Europeans, Asians, Africans. So in a way connecting to their continents. Americans, Europeans, Asians, and Africans. Based on their appearance, their physical characteristics. What Carolus Linnaeus had done, he observed the differences among and similarities among these organisms, and they classified them together. If they are similar, they put them together, or if they're different, he put them in different categories. So like that, he became the father of classification. So he also could see the differences among humans. And what was the basis for this? Physical differences. Plus, they always try to connect the physical differences to emotional and behavioral differences. We talked about then somatotyping. Some of the anthropologists have attempted this, that they wanted to connect the body type to nature, their behavior and their nature. Similarly, Carolus Linnaeus, he classified humans based on their physical characteristics as well as emotional and behavioral characteristics into 4 subgroups: American, European, Asian, and African. Okay, so this happened in 18th century. Similarly, Johann Blumenbach, okay, depending on how you say it, sometimes you may say Johann or Johann Blumenbach, the pronunciation varies quite a bit. He is considered to be the founder of biological anthropology. Johann Blumenbach, from 18th to 19th century, between 18th and 19th century, who contributed quite a bit to the biological anthropology or physical anthropology field. He divided humans into 5 groups or 5 races. Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. So do you see quite a bit of an overlap of how people classify it?
I said it didn't go into the eugenics in this classification, did they?
See, eugenics is a term where you took the concept of those differences and trying to define them as good and bad, and only allow the good goods to actually have, are good people are considered, those considered to be good, to marry and have children. So that is kind of an effect of this understanding of this difference. They did. So these people might have not gone, because we have seen in those lectures that these people facilitated the concept of separation and classification. Okay, Galton's time, that where we have noticed that, of course, it matches with the similar timing, that he took a different turn, and there were other people that we talked about. Davenport, for example, have went into the concept of eugenics. But these people provided the basis for it, basis for the classification. Okay. So mostly when migration was happening, when European colonies were actually established themselves, they started seeing people with different colors, different characteristics. They wanted to classify them different, like that Caucasians, Mongolians, Malayans, Ethiopians, Americans, like different classes they came. We are going to pick up some of these and going to discuss the criteria for them. Okay, I wanted to give a brief history related to it. Okay, now let's go with the idea that we are going to work further on this. Yeah, we are going to use Ashley Montagu's. Ashley Montagu is a British American anthropologist. He's a British American anthropologist. His name is Ashley. Do you study about him in social anthropology? No? Okay. So what he had done, based on some careful measurements, so quantitative, basically he quantified some of the physical characteristics, and based on them, they created three races, or they classified humans into three races. Some of them fall into the previous categories. The three major categories we usually see, with slight variation from source to source sometimes, but the most common human races are these things: Caucasians, Negroids, and Mongoloids. Caucasoid or Caucasian, Mongoloid, Mongolian, Negroids. So you see all those components, geographical variation and morphological variation is evident in them. Although it may not stay the same now. If you go to Americas, you'll find mixed features because migration had happened. But otherwise, you can find this: Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid. So Caucasoids, who are Caucasoids? These people are originated in Europe, Middle East, and India. Okay. So also within India, we see some of the subclassification of Dravidians, for example. I think the Risley's classification talks about this, correct? So Caucasides are those who originated from Europe, Middle East, and India. Usually we refer to them, those people who are tall, who have short noses. Those kind of people, we refer to them as Caucasoids. They have range of variation in their skin. So we talked about them from geographically, through geographical origins. And also color of the skin also varies from pale in cool climates. In cooler climates, they probably have some pale color, to olive brown colors in warm climates. Olive brown. Pale to olive brown. Okay, this is first group, Caucasoid. Second group is Mongoloids. Who are Mongoloids? Mongoloids are those people who came from or who live in Southeast and Central Asia. Southeast and Central Asia, like Mongolia, Tibet, so Chinese region, China. American Indians, Eskimos also seem to share these characteristics. Some of the features, physical features that you notice are also shared by American Indians, natives of Americas, and Eskimos. So most common feature that you notice in them is the Mongoloid eye. Mongoloid eye. There is an extra fold of skin on the eyes, The opening of the eye is narrow. Opening of the eye is narrow. So based on that, this is one key characteristic that we classify them. I'm going to talk to you briefly about those quantities or those characteristics and how do we measure them. And the third group is negroids. So negroids are well recognized based on their skin color, dark brown to black skin. And where do they originate from? They mainly originate from Africa. They originate from Africa. They originate from Africa. Also, their hair looks very different. Their hair is mostly curly, tightly curled hair you see. Like that, human races can be classified into three, as I was telling you. Depending on the source, you may find a few other additional groups added to them. Okay, sometimes they overlap, so some people do not consider them as separate groups. Instead, they place them together with one of these groups. Okay, so these are some three common races that majority of the people recognize, or at least in literature to recognize about. Whether they are valid or not today, you can definitely differentiate them from other groups. Okay, they live in different parts of the world. So if you see people in Caucasoids in red color, is Americas, many regions in Americas, for example. Okay, Africa, part of Australia, part of Asia, Europe. So you see majority of most of the European countries are there, plus some other countries, Americas and bit of Asia and Australia. Similarly, Mongoloids, Southeast Asia, these regions, northern parts of our country, so other parts of the Asia, the northern Asia that you notice here. Okay, and also the northern part of the Americas, you may find Mongoloids, and then mostly negroids from Africa. Sometimes you probably have studied this in Risley's classification, Australian group, or sorry, Australoid features that you may find. So people, natives from Australia, I think we see some of those elements in India. That is in blue color regions. So the Australoid elements probably are present within Australia, within India as well. Some other regions here. Okay, like that. Then sometimes they talk about more like capoid or khoisanid. So these type of rare groups are also found in some areas of Africa, for example, like this. But otherwise, Mongoloid, Negroid, Caucasoid, the three most common groups. Okay. So you see a geographical variation. So what should be the racial criteria? How should these races be recognized? Is there any standard for this? So yeah, for this, I've seen in one of these materials, they talk about guidelines given by Robert Boyd. Guidelines given by Robert Boyd to create a criteria for classifying races. What are those characteristics? These are some features, some characteristic features that we notice in them which are distinct among them. So we can use them to classify them or differentiate them from others. So racial criteria is a methodology that is being recommended by many. Here we are going to briefly look at or get an idea from Robert Boyd's classification of races and the criteria used for classifying races. Or what should be the criteria that we have to use? It may or may not hold true today, but what should be the criteria? The criteria for classifying humans into various races. So the criteria must be objective. Criteria must be objective in nature, not subjective. It should be objective. So that different individuals, different investigators or researchers don't show individual variation. They don't add individual bias. Should not add individual bias to this. So this classification must depend on objective method, not on a subjective, so that there won't be individual differences in studying this population. And in the best case scenario, this criteria should be non-adaptive, meaning they should not change in a given environment. They should be more like fixed. If you're saying this is a race group, you said there are inherent characteristics which define them, then they should stay unchanged. They should not change biologically because you change your environment. If they are changing, meaning you're not fixed entity, those characteristics will be gone. So in case if you're really defining them, the criteria should be non-adaptive, so that environment or natural selection in the environment should not play or cannot play any role or cannot change basically. That is what they are emphasizing in the next point as well. So criteria should be non-adaptive, so natural selection cannot have much role, and this criteria should not be modified by environment. Whatever basis that you have taken, environment should not modify it. So again, fits into the category that I told you. So it's more like a fixed entity. So some other related points to this, that no environment should change it. Criteria should not be subject to high rate of mutation. So mutation should not change, because that is what we see in natural selection. Mutations do happen and they get changed. If it is really essential for something to us, it should not change.
So these are the ways to classify given the conditions here.
So these are the guidelines classified. If there exist races, if there exist some permanent differences that we notice, then they should satisfy this criteria. So these were acted as guidelines, but in reality is different from this. Because to a certain extent you may be able to follow it, but many of the characteristics that we are talking about are environmentally influenced characteristics. They change. Skin color changes depending on where you live. And of course, there are underlying genetic factors to them, but they're not fixed. So these are all the guidelines, the proper guidelines, if at all we need to classify races. Some of them are satisfied, some of them are not satisfied, some of them are not met in the process. Okay, the last point here is the criteria should be controlled by a known genetic mechanism. Knowledge about that genetic change, the genetic control mechanism is important. So what is the reason behind that change? What is the reason behind that character should be known. Okay. Let's have a look at what are those factors that are being used in classifying humans into various races. So here we are beginning with biological basis of morphological variation. We're also talking about the basis, biological basis of racial classification, and how we differentiate races based on what characteristics. We're focusing on these three things here. So first, I think the foremost one, something that is obvious to all of us in a way, is skin color. Skin color forms the key method or feature based on which we classify or differentiate humans. But biologically, what is happening here? Biologically, what do we notice here? The skin color is because of the melanin pigmentation. I think we kind of talked about it, right? It is because of melanin pigmentation. Melanin, a pigment that is produced by our skin cells, especially cells called melanocytes. So melanocytes, the cells found in the basal layer of the skin, and they are responsible for production of melanin. This is a dark pigment that we see underneath our skin. Not only skin, you may find this in eyes, you may find this in hair. The coloration of them, the appearance of them depends on this dark color pigment called melanin. So why do we have that variation in color? I don't think we disagree with this concept that we do vary in terms of color. And especially when I say we as Indians, we as Asians, do differ from, let's say, within India itself, we differ from Chinese in terms of color. We differ quite a bit from Europeans, Americans, Africans. Okay, that is because of melanin pigmentation. But why? Why do you have such a color variation? What is the use of that variation? Something that you all know very well. So what is the use of melanin pigment in our skin?
Absorb vitamin D or create vitamin D.
So basically, yes, to absorb sunlight,
Sunlight to
indeed,
synthesize.
correct, and also protection from UV rays. Protection from UV rays. Okay, you're absolutely right. This is a key idea here. So, in different environments, you may find different coloration. That, as you see here, in some of the countries, you notice here where the color change variation happens with temperature. So the skin absorbs UV rays from the sun. What does our skin do? Skin absorbs the UV rays, and using that, our body can produce vitamin D. So melanin pigment in the skin. We have melanin pigment in the skin. Okay, and there is a variation in this melanin pigment. And the skin job is to absorb the UV rays from the sun and utilize it to produce vitamin D. Okay. So what does that mean? If you need sunlight to produce vitamin D, and if you are living in a region that receives less sunlight, so if you go to places where not much sunlight is seen, they will have less melanin pigment. They'll be more fairer. So less sunlight results in lighter skinned people. So what happens if they light skin? There is not too much of protection, which is not needed because you're not exposed too much to the sunlight. Still, you are allowing enough of the sunlight into your body. So vitamin D can be made. So these people living in regions where less sunlight is seen or noticed, they would have less melanin in their skin. So naturally, they would need less sunshine to make vitamin. Because you're only receiving so much of sunlight, there is no point in having a good barrier, the big barrier for this. So they have less melanin pigment, they look more fairer. That is to support the concept of vitamin D production despite of having low sunlight. So there's an adjustment of the body to the environment.
The less melanin means less vitamin D.
Indirectly, yes. Less indirectly, what happens? So we're talking about protective layer. If you have more melanin, it will stop more sunlight. If you have less melanin, we're connecting to, I think, first of all, I would like you to think about the source amount of heat requirement for vitamin D production. And then with respect to that, you correlate it with the melanin pigmentation. So you have to receive enough sunlight to make vitamin D. That is a requirement. So there are places where you don't receive enough sunlight. It's usually cloudy, it doesn't shine with that intensity that you normally see in tropics. So what happens? You're receiving less sunlight. There is no need to have enough melanin because you require less protection from UV. Plus, if you produce less melanin, you are receiving enough sunlight to make vitamin D. Do you see the reasoning here? Okay, if you may get confused if you use different reasoning to this. So in places like India or Africa, other countries where we receive enough sunlight, you need enough protection. So you have more pigmentation. More pigmentation, we have more sunlight exposure. So you still get enough with more melanin pigmentation here. In other words, you're protecting your body from that exposure. I remember when I went to Canada, the doctors there said, you don't receive enough sunlight. So they recommended us, brown people who migrated there or who went there, doctors recommended us to take vitamin D supplements every day. We didn't realize it for about, I think, almost 2-3 years. When I was in Europe, I didn't realize this. So when I went to Canada, I started having some thyroid-related problems, which we could connect to vitamin D. And doctor recommended take vitamin D supplement every day because you have more protection, more protective layer on your body. Because it will take enough time and generations for us to change it, right? So our bodies don't receive enough sunlight. So it's essential for us to maintain the levels of vitamin D in the body because it seems to be playing a very important role for body's functioning. So they recommended us to take vitamin D supplements every day. So like that, the layer that we already have, if you're living in a cold climate where you don't receive too much of sunlight, so it is not allowing enough vitamin D to reach for enough vitamin D to be produced through sunlight. So like that, this seems to be a biological adaptation to our needs of the body, correct? Either you can see in the form of vitamin D production, you can also explain it in the sense of UV damage to the body. Okay, so we are clearly seeing there's a biological basis to this concept. How do you differentiate people into this? This is something that really very well known. So some terminology is important here. So the populations in the world are divided into 3 major racial categories based on the skin color. So based on skin color, you can divide them into 3 categories. What are they? Leucoderm, like leukocytes, white blood cells, like leucoderms. Those people with white skin. So based on skin, you can classify humans into 3 races. What are they? Leucoderms, white-skinned people. Xanthoderms, xantho. Have you heard about the pigment called xanthophyll? Xantho means yellow. So people with yellow skin, slightly yellowish tinge, different quantity of melanin pigment here, no other pigment gets formed here. So less pigment or moderate amounts of pigment. So this gives rise to yellow skin color. So this is called xantho. Xantho means yellow. Leuco means white. And melano means dark. As we talked about, melanin is, so melanoderms are black skinned people. So these are obvious, I don't have to explain you. Leucoderms are those white skinned people who are Caucasoids. And xanthoderms are Mongoloids. They have some yellowish color. You're able to differentiate here, fair, yellow, dark. How you see here? Fair, yellow, dark. And melanoderms are black skinned people. We tend to call them as negroids. Okay, this is simple and straightforward. So this is one feature that we use to classify humans. Of course, there is variation within respect to that. Some people went further on to classify humans into more specific groups. I'll briefly show you that. in one of the document I'm going to share with you, there also you would notice some of the extension to this concept. Okay, because sometimes you may not see, because people may have different shades in their skin color. So people went on explaining why they have different shades. Like Lushan Felix, okay, talked about this. Eugene Fisher talked about this. Okay, they basically expanded this classification. So one example I'm showing here is Fitzpatrick scale. So what do you notice here? You can actually see if you're going from the left to right, you are seeing that people with less and less melanin from the left towards the right, it is increasing amount of melanin pigmentation that you can see. So from left to right, melanin pigmentation increases. As you see it in the middle, you may find the yellowish tinge, brownish, more dark brown. And the response also varies with respect to UV. People who have less melanin, they are more sensitive to UV. They are more sensitive to UV. They get the burning sensation when they expose to sunlight. You might have seen, right? So Americans are usually, some Americans, Canadians, a lot of people, they move to the in the winter time or a little later than that, they go to beaches. Most of the time they prefer to go to beaches. How do they appear? They turn too reddish because they get that burning sensation because of exposure to sunlight, and they don't have much melanin pigment to protect. So these people are UV sensitive. If you move from the left to right, they become more and more resistant to UV. And these people experience tanning then burning. What happens? They get tanned. They will have a layer of that gets formed here. More intensity of melanin pigmentation you see in them, which protects them. They have that ability. So like that, people can be classified into not one, multiple groups, as you see 6 classes here, based on melanin pigmentation and UV sensitivity. Okay, so classified them into 6 subgroups. Basically, more patterns, nothing else. So white, very fair, white, fair, creamy white, brown, dark brown, black. Okay, if you just show the way I've shown you here, that would be sufficient. 6 groups: white with very fair, fair, creamy white, brown, dark brown, black. Expansion to what we have seen basically. Okay. So this is about skin color and classification based on skin color. Lot of varieties are there in how they classified it, but I think this is sufficient for us to know 3 major categories and one of the extended categories. Okay. So next, hair type we talk about. Second category. Second criteria is hair type. So based on the hair type, you may find 3 different hair forms, something that we probably are familiar. Okay. Here again, first we'll talk about hair form. Otherwise, you can also see hair color, hair texture as well. So form of the hair, type of the hair. So some people have smooth hair or straight hair, smooth and straight. Some people have wavy hair. So it's like straight, if you have a straight thread, stretched thread, versus thread that has like wavy nature, wavy, like a wave. Sea waves or ocean waves that you see. like this, slight curvature. Woolly form is tight curls. So what happens, wavy, if you actually use waviness, is eventually too much of waviness leads to curliness. So either you have extended form or straight form, wavy form which is intermediate, and curly. Curly is where they have curls. You see Africans. I thought when after seeing the African curls, I thought that is one of the trend, that's how they actually groom their hair, I thought. But it's natural. Correct? Too much of curling results in that tight curls in their hair. Not sure how visible it is, but here, the right hand side, you can see that this is wavy, this is straight. There are terms to this. So trichus refers to hair. Trichus refers to hair. Leotrichus refers to smooth form of hair. Excuse me. Leotrichus, smooth hair. Leotrichus. So trichus suffix is common. All of them have trichus as a common suffix. Leo means smooth. Cymo means wavy. Cymo means is wavy. Cymotrichus. Cymotrichus. So three groups. We're talking about Leotrichus, Cymotrichus, and Eulotrichus. Eulotrichus refers to the woolly nature. So in a way, you can classify them into, have you ever seen Mongoloids? Chinese, how do their hair looks like? It's usually straight, right? They can hardly comb their hair. It's very difficult to comb their hair if you've ever noticed it. Jackie Chan, for example, or some of the Hollywood actors. If you notice them, okay, their hair usually tends to stand straight like that. So of course, artists have multiple ways to groom them, but otherwise, usually it tends to stand like that. So Mongoloid hair is like that. It's Leotrichus in nature. Mongoloid hair is more Leotrichus in nature. So they have more straight hair. And Caucasoids tend to have Cymotrichus, slight wave nature. You do see a lot of overlap. You don't find someone with exact these features. Mixture is seen, but in general, the belief is that so wavy form is seen more commonly in Caucasoids, and woolly form is more commonly seen in Negroids. Okay, and what defines the shape? It looks like the follicle. You heard about hair follicles that we have at the bottom. Okay, underneath the skin layer, the epidermal layer, you find this structural component from bottom of which hair grows. So we have some structured components or elements called hair follicles. Okay, so this happens to be underneath this layer. So shape of this seems to define the nature of the hair, the shape of that. So biologically, we have this biologically in us. It's inherited to us. And usually this tends to follow Mendelian characteristics. Second, hair texture. So hair texture, we're talking about the texture of the hair. If you touch the hair, it may look coarse. It may look coarse or medium coarse or very fine. So either it looks very thin or fine or coarse or in between. Here you see somewhat overlap here. Coarse hair is commonly seen in Negroids. Coarse hair is commonly seen in Negroids, and medium to coarse hair is more common in Mongoloids. Medium to coarse in Mongoloids and fine to medium in Caucasoids. Fine to medium hair in Caucasoids, medium to coarse in Mongoloids, and coarse hair in Negroids. And within Mongoloids, Chinese and Japanese also show coarse hair. As I was telling, mostly medium to coarse. Chinese and Japanese tend to show coarse type of hair. So we can also use these features of hair to distinguish races. So then we'll move on to head. We move on to head. Okay, so I'm going to give you some brief ideas on this. So next couple of things where we are going to take a few anthropometric measurements here. They are quantifiable nature. So these are those metric characteristics, those quantifiable characteristics. What are they? Like cephalic index, head dimensions, measuring head dimensions. Like we're briefly talking about in forensic anthropology, differentiating between genders, skull size, skull shape. So similarly, races can also be differentiated based on what is called cephalic or cranial index. It is referred to as cephalic index or cranial index. So what do they do here? If you notice here, so this is the head, this is the front part, this is the back part. So what do? They measure the width or breadth of the head or breadth of the skull, basically head here. So this width that they would measure, and they divide this breadth with length, head length, from this point to this point. So length longitudinal and head horizontal. They measure the breadth, this, and the length. Okay, head breadth divided by head length multiplied by 100 gives rise to cephalic index. Okay, this is called cephalic index. So breadth of head divided by length of head multiplied by 100. So they calculated these numbers and classified them. Like they put them into various categories. For example, if you put them this number, this CI or cranial index number up to 69.9, up to 70, approximately up to 70. This is called hyperdolichocephalic, or I would start with something really simple here like dolichocephalic. 70 to 76 approximately, or below 76. This is called dolicho. Dolicho means narrow, not broad, but narrow. So the bottom one, length is more compared to breadth. Okay, that is why it looks narrow. The top value is less. The bottom value is more. Relatively, I'm talking about. So then it falls in the narrow because breadth is less. They're more narrow. These are called dolicho, narrow heads. Dolicho, cephalic, cephalon, head region. Okay, so dolicho means narrow heads. Falls between 70 to 75.9. Even narrower than that is called hyperdolicho. It is also dolicho, but hyperdolicho, more narrower. So dolicho is narrow, hyperdolicho is more narrower version of the heads. So below this 69.9, below the 70, basically, in centimeters. So what comes next? Dolicho means narrow. Narrow will become moderately broader, and then broader, and then hyper broad. So narrow, hyper narrow, narrow, medium broad, broad, hyper broad. So like that, the numbers do vary here. Approximately, if you remember, that is all right. Below 70 centimeters is this. 70 to 76 approximately is this. 76 to 80 is this, the next 5 units. 81 to 85, 85 and above. So below 69.9, above 85.6. Don't come under this. Otherwise, dolicho, meso, brachy. Meso means middle, medium. Brachy means broad. Brachy means broad. Meso means medium. Dolicho means narrow. Okay, right? So like that, you can categorize these people. So how do they correlate with the different races? Some of these we can easily distinguish. So these are some of those examples. Caucasoids. Caucasoids usually have narrow heads, dolichocephalics to brachy. So they tend to have mostly narrow versions of head, but it does vary from dolicho to brachy. So there's enough variation, but usually they tend to have narrow heads, more longer heads than the broad heads. How do you feel when you see Mongoloids like Chinese, Japanese? Do they have longer heads or broader heads? What is more, length is more or breadth is more? Chinese head. How do you see Jackie Chan?
Breadth.
Breadth,
Excuse me.
right? They have short and bigger heads. They're not long. Correct? So remember, if you want to compare DiCaprio, for example, with Jackie Chan, look at how their faces are. Jackie Chan has more broader face than DiCaprio. Brad Pitt. Okay? So Mongoloids tend to have more brachycephalic heads. So broad heads are more common in Mongoloids. Caucasoids have variation, dolicho to brachy. Whereas Negroids have predominantly dolichocephalic heads, more narrow heads. But variation you would find within them as well. But usually, predominantly, it is dolichocephalic in nature. Do you see sutures in their heads? We talked in the last class. Those gaps. Okay. So this is how we use the cranial index to calculate this. We should be able to briefly write cranial index as a feature, define the formula, briefly show about the classes and corresponding races. Same with morphological facial index. Faces can also be categorized. They've also attempted to measure the face dimensions. Okay, the length and breadth again, but here there are different terms for this. Facial index is calculated from nasion to gnathion. You see here, this part is nasion, just above the, or just at the beginning of the nose. This portion, this is called nasion. Nasion to gnathion, the tip at the chin. So they would measure this length and this is divided by interzygomatic width. So these are zygomatic bones. These two are zygomatic bones. These bones by your orbits, eye orbits. These are called, or beneath that, these bones, that cheekbones that you usually have here. So these bones, zygomatic bones. Okay, the distance between zygomatic bones or interzygomatic width it is called. From this part to this part, this width, this height into 100. So very much like cranial index, but they have taken facial features here. Okay, so based on that, if this is broad face, it is called Euripro. Broad means Euripro, medium means Mesopro, and lean or thin means Lepto. Always remember, Lepto is a common word that we have. Lepto means thin. Leptoproscopic means thin heads. Mesoporoscopic, medium heads. Euriproscopic, broader heads. And very much like what we learned in the cranial index, hyper euriproscopic and hyper leptoproscopic. So you see here, euriproscopic is broad heads, meso is the middle, and you can clearly see lepto is more elongated, more thinner, narrowed versions. You see. Okay, usually you see some correlation with the previous version here. So narrow faces are mostly seen in Caucasoids, narrow to medium, for example, and more broad spaces are common to Mongoloids. Okay, otherwise a lot of overlap can be seen within races here. Lot of overlap can be seen here, but otherwise more narrow can be correlated with Caucasoids. Medium can be correlated, with mixture. Right? There's no distinction or distinct features to them here. And broad faces are more common in Mongoloids. Okay, so this is another criteria. Skin color, facial index or morphological index, we talked about. Also cranial index, head dimensions, face dimensions, skin color. Okay, and also nasal index. Nasal index. So here it is measuring the nasal region, the nose region. So breadth of the nose divided by height of the nose into 100. Breadth and height. So they use calipers like that to measure it. So this region that you notice here, and they would normally measure the breadth. So breadth divided by height of the nose. This breadth, this height. See in the image here, from here to here, and this breadth. Based on that, either it is narrow nose, medium nose, broad nose, narrow, medium, broad. So same, but we're talking about the noses. So the suffix for nose is rhino, like rhinoceros. Rhinoceros we say, right? So rhino or rhine referring to nose. So lepto means narrow nose, meso means medium nose, platy means broad nose. So lepto, thin, I told you, right? Thin means narrow, leptorhine, narrow nose, meso, medium nose, and platy, broad nose. based on the normal calculations or measurements, they would put them into categories like this. What is considered to be narrow within human population? What is considered to be broad? Broad is 85 to about 100, almost to 100 centimeters. 85. Okay, this is the index that we are talking about, right? So, and then 70 to 84.9 is medium. 55 to 69 or 70 is left. So we
This
have to
is
have some
in
reference for this, right? So based on the measurements, they have put this into categories like this. Yes, sir, go ahead.
so this is in millimeters.
So it could be millimeters. I think we're talking about, yes, we're taking the ratio of it and multiplying with 100, right? So it's so and normal dimensions wise, it has to be in millimeters, both the values, top and bottom values. We multiply, we take the percentage. Okay, so basically idea is narrow versions of nose, medium version of the nose, broad version of the nose, and those at extreme are very narrow, very broad. Hyperplaty and hyperlepto.
These are not in use. We are just studying what has been the trend, right?
What has been explained in literature, what has been used in understanding races, or trying to provide some form of measurements related to that. This has been used as a basis. Okay, so how are they designed or how are they present in what groups we normally notice it? Okay, if you see it here, Hazel index. So usually Caucasoids have leptorrhini. Caucasoids tend to have leptorrhini, narrow noses. Caucasoids have narrow noses below 0.48. So narrow. Okay, like Europeans, if you see, they tend to have narrow noses. And Mongoloids they are mesorrhini. Mongoloids tend to be mesorrhini or moderately broad noses, medium type of nose. Mongoloids. So in between. And whereas Negroids have more broader versions of nose, short and broad noses. So above 0.53. Okay, so narrow noses in Caucasoids, broad noses in Negroids, moderately broad noses in Mongoloids. Rough. Okay. We also kind of talked about the environmental factor behind nose shape. Why Caucasoids have long noses? This is to allow or provide time for air to warm up a bit in cold climates. So in cold climates, people tend to have longer noses. Okay. Otherwise, there are also other factors. They even sometimes talk about nasal spine. So nasal spine, this region, they would even measure this angle. Okay. So in Caucasoids seems to have more prominent version of spine, whereas Negroids have a very small spine, don't have much differentiation in how it sits here, and somewhat prominent spine or intermediate for Mongoloids. So they even look into this angle of the nose as well, which is known as nasal spine. Okay, so not only nasal index, nasal spine, even they went on further talking about shape of the orbits as well sometimes. So Caucasoid seems to have round orbits in which these are the pockets in which eyes sit, where eyes are placed. So more or less rounded in Caucasoids and rectangular in Negroids and rounded and somewhat circular in Mongoloids. So some variation in the appearance of eyes and eye orbits can also be seen. So some of these features we correlate in 1.6 as well. When we look more like apes, how are these orbits are? We focus on them as well. So rounded, somewhat square in Caucasoids, rectangular in Negroids, rounded and somewhat circular in Mongoloids. And one distinguishing feature that you can see in these people is the face shape, overall face shape. So with respect to especially the jaws that we have. So prognathism, the protruding nature. If you see the face, prognathism, we talked about that. Prognathism is more common in women, relatively more common in women than males. We talked about that in gender differences in forensic anthropology. In Caucasoid, it looks more or less straight. You don't see prognathic nature, it is straight. Whereas Negroids, you find these prognathic faces. You see here, in Negroids, do you see the jaw, how it is actually sticking out? The jaw tends to stick out like this, sticks out like this. So jaw is, if you actually draw a line like this, you can see jaw is protruding out. So this is called prognathism. To draw an angle, you see that this face, the bottom part of the face comes out. That is prognathism, the extending jaw that they have, or jaw sticking out comparatively to the face. If you put it here at the nasal spine, you can clearly see it's coming out. Otherwise, it's supposed to be more flat. Our faces in biologically in evolution got a shape of more flatter faces. I'll explain that. I'll explain that in biological factors behind human evolution. There we are designed to have more flatter faces. But within us, some people have slight prognathism or some extended jaws that you notice in them. So whereas Caucasians have more straight, Mongoloids have variable versions. So Negroids definitely prognathic, Caucasian straight, Mongoloids variable. So prognathism is mostly used for defining the Negroids. Skin color, prognathism is more apparent. Okay. Then another very distinguishing feature is Mongoloid eye. Mongoloid eye. Have you ever observed Chinese women or, doesn't matter, males or female, Chinese, Japanese? What do you notice in them? What is standing out in their facial appearance? They're shorter. Usually they tend to be short, right? They're not too tall. Because you also see that they have, some peculiar appearance to their eyes. And the most distinguishing feature that you find in Mongoloid's eye is Mongoloid eye, because Mongoloid is a feature of them. This is nothing but eye with epicanthic fold. You have an epicanthic fold, a bulgy layer on eye. So it feels as if their eyes are not completely open to us. Correct? In them, it feels like their eyes are not open. They're still semi-closed or semi-open. So this fold that you notice, this bulgy fold, okay, and usually tend to be this upper part. Usually it tends to be the upper part, the bulgy layer that you see, which kind of occludes their eye a bit. So this appearance is called a Mongoloid eye. So this fold or upper, sometimes even on the lower skin over the eyelid that you notice is known as Mongoloid eye. So this appearance of the skin layer that you see here, this layer. Okay, so this is called a Mongoloid eye. So Chinese, for example, mostly those Mongoloids that we talked about. And plus some Native Americans and Europeans like Scandinavians show this. So more distinct feature in mongoloids. In the depiction, you can see it. In the Chinese eye, this is more like a fat layer. Both Caucasians and Chinese or mongoloids have it, but there's more of it, more fat in their skin layer here, in around the eye. Why? There are some theories, I think difficult to prove, but there are some theories on this. So, but the people who show mongoloid eyes or mongoloids, those who don't have it, usually Caucasians don't have it. So either you have it or you don't have it. Where is it common? It's common in mongoloids. Less common in other groups. Either Africans or Caucasians, they don't seem to have.
Is it Mendelian trait?
Good question. I don't think so. I don't think I've ever read it as a Mendelian trait. I doubt that. But don't know whether people have studied it or not. Don't know. I have to check. Okay. So these are some. I've taken it from I think normally eye surgeries they perform, right? Some doctors were they're talking about they correct for this. So these seems to be corrected, and at different levels they say. So you see it here, the fat layer that you notice, more fat and more fat. Okay, I think some people say they can be corrected because they're more seen as a cosmetic problem. Right? So surgically, I think people found a ways to correct it. But why do they have in the first place? They say that in Mongolian desert, there is a higher chance of getting dust into their eyes. So they say I think it provides an additional protection to them. Additional protection from the dust storms could be the reason. Okay, why they have, because they live close to the Mongolian desert. Okay, what else? Even fingerprints can be used in classifying races. Not to greater extent, but can be done in literature. So they can use fingerprints. Do you know how is the study of fingerprints called? Dermatoglyphics. It is called dermatoglyphics. Dermatoglyphics. Derma means skin and the glyphics means scar. So what do they study here? They study the ridge patterns, the patterns that we have on, of course, on fingers, toes, okay, on palms, but most commonly that we use the ridge patterns that we find on fingers.
We also have a class at 6:30.
Is it? What class? Your archaeology class?
Archaeology class.
At what time?
Archaeology.
6:30. Okay. I'll close it. Just 2-3 minutes. I'll finish the class. Okay, but you got the idea. Yes, go ahead. So we can categorize people into 3 groups, at least 3 groups. Some people have what is called arches, right? Arch-like. So you may find something that looks like an arch, like this. So there is no circle, okay? Or a loop. So loops is where they connected. They are connected like this. Like if you form a loop or draw a loop, so the appearance of the pattern looks like a loop, or it looks like an arch, or it looks like a world, like circles. And interestingly, I do this exercise in the class. Even us, we don't have same patterns on all our fingers. We have mixed patterns on our fingers. You can notice, can you recognize them? Can you recognize them on your fingers? What do you find? Pick 2 fingers, any 2 fingers and see what you have. On my thumb, I have world. I see full circles. Whereas on my pointing finger, I see a loop. See what you have.
I see arcs and loops mostly.
Mostly, right? Only arches. Okay. What about you, Shweta? Are you able to
So,
distinguish?
yes, sir.
Yes, what do you have?
The world.
On all of them, check thumb and check one of the fingers.
I think in finger it is loop.
So we find mixture of things. We don't find exactly the same, but there's some pattern that they can recognize. They attempted to correlate that. I will show you the document that I'm going to share with you and quickly tell you a few points that you may need to know. Okay, so I'm going to share this document with you where I talked about some of these concepts that we discussed. Okay, this concept of nasal index, high epicanthic fold, dermatoglyphics, I mentioned them. Briefly talked about how frequency of distribution, a finger pattern can be seen here. Okay, whorls are more common in Mongoloid population and least common in Caucasoids. Factual data you can read from this handout. So more common in Mongoloids and less common in Caucasoids. And loops appear most frequently among Caucasoids. While among Mongoloids and Negroid groups, loops are found more or less equal frequency. So some correlation you can find, but you cannot exactly say that only these people find this. But some tendency that can be noticed here, that whorls are common among Mongoloids. Okay, like that we can also use other components like blood groups. Blood groups can also be used in classifying races. So depending on their presence, depending on how common they are in a given area. Right, we talked about North American, South American populations, we find O blood group like that. Blood groups can also be used to a certain extent to classify people. So Caucasoids shows relatively high incidence of A2. Okay, and comparatively high incidence of blood group B with with moderate frequency of Rh negative is among Negroids. Negroids show more blood group B. Low incidence of blood group, subversion of blood group A2 version, okay, is seen in Mongoloids. Like that, some criteria can be seen are connected to blood groups and the races. Okay, I think otherwise eyes, I mentioned about this, nasal index, head, so cranial index, hair. Okay, and also I briefly talked about stature as well. So tallness and dwarfness. Negroids tend to be more dwarfer, and Caucasoids tend to be taller, like Sikhs and Rajputs in India. Okay, and also people of northwestern Europeans, they tend to be taller. We recognize them based on height. So some of these features can be seen in them. Similarly, Negroids tend to be like pygmies. They tend to be dwarf. Like that, some amount of correlation can be seen with the height as well as the races. Okay, right. With that, we finished talking about the biological basis for this. Tomorrow, when I'm going to briefly review this, I'll ask you what are the metric features and non-metric features. Okay, and we'll continue with the remaining subtopics of it, crossing, race crossing, and racism in social context. Okay, and I'll send you a video link to watch before coming to the class. Right, I'll stop the class here. Okay, thank you. Then we'll have a session tomorrow evening. Okay, right. I'm not planning for a test this week. Keep that in mind. I think we also have a class on Sunday. I realize that. So we'll have the test later. Once I think we're coming to the end of the sessions. So we'll plan the test later. Right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, sir.